Maya Thompson's heart raced as she entered the crowded courtroom, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The air was thick with the weight of judgment, not just from the onlookers, but from the man who sat behind the imposing desk at the front of the room. Judge Richard Mallory. Known for his no-nonsense demeanor and staunch adherence to the letter of the law, Mallory had earned a reputation as a figure who rarely deviated from precedent. To him, the law was the law, and there was little room for compassion or flexibility. Maya's case was a simple one, or so it seemed. She was there for a routine traffic violation, a small offense that hardly seemed worthy of taking up the court's time. Yet, as she took her seat and waited for her name to be called, she couldn't help but feel the irony of the moment. A minor infraction, yes, but this encounter with the justice system was far from routine. Maya had spent her career as a public defender, working on cases that highlighted the flaws in the very system she was now facing. For years, she had quietly advocated for reforms in federal justice standards, pushing for changes that would address the disparities that often went unnoticed by those in power. Judge Mallory's voice broke through her thoughts. "Maya Thompson," he called out, his tone sharp and authoritative. Maya stood up, gathering her composure as she made her way to the front of the courtroom. She knew this would be an ordinary session for most people, but for her, it was an opportunity to make a point. As she stood before him, the judge eyed her coldly, his expression giving nothing away. She had seen that look before, the one that assumed guilt before any explanation was given. Mallory looked down at the case file before him, and then back up at her, his gaze unwavering. "Miss Thompson, this is a straightforward violation. You were caught speeding, and the law is clear. A fine is necessary to maintain order and ensure that everyone is held accountable." He paused, as if weighing his words. "Do you have any defense to offer?" Maya hesitated, then calmly responded, "Your Honor, I understand the law, but there's more to this situation than just the fine. I believe the real issue lies in how we enforce laws that disproportionately affect certain communities, including those who, like me, have spent years working toward reforming a broken system." The room fell silent. Maya's words weren't typical for a defendant, and Judge Mallory raised an eyebrow in surprise. His response was quick, almost dismissive. "Your personal opinions, Miss Thompson, do not change the facts of the case. You violated the law, and now you must face the consequences. A fine of $200 is hereby imposed." Maya nodded, knowing the fine was inevitable. But what Judge Mallory didn't realize was that his decision, so seemingly minor, would spark the very movement Maya had been trying to build, a movement that would soon echo far beyond this courtroom. Judge Mallory's gavel struck the desk, signaling the end of the brief session. Maya remained standing for a moment, her face a mask of calm, even as the weight of the judge's words lingered in the air. She didn't argue, didn't plead her case any further. Instead, she simply nodded, acknowledging the court's decision with a quiet grace that only made the judge more certain of his authority. $200, Miss Thompson," Mallory repeated, his voice cutting through the silence. "Pay the fine, and you'll be free to go." Maya stepped back, her mind already shifting from the confines of this courtroom to the larger task at hand. She had known this day would come, an encounter with a judge who followed the rules without question. But she hadn't expected it to feel so insignificant. To Mallory, it was a routine infraction. To her, it was a mere footnote in the grander narrative she was trying to write. As she turned to leave the courtroom, her eyes briefly met those of the onlookers seated in the gallery. They were mostly silent, some observing with indifference, others with curiosity. There was no way they could know what was really happening here, the true story behind Maya's presence in that room. Most saw only a woman being fined for speeding, but Maya knew that the conversation needed to go deeper, and she was ready to make that happen. Outside, the sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the courthouse steps. Maya paused for a moment to breathe. Her fight for justice was not something that could be solved in a single day, or even a single court session. But the seed had been planted. As she made her way to her car, Maya pulled out her phone, scrolling through messages from colleagues and supporters. The next step was clear. She would turn this moment into something bigger. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, Judge Mallory gathered his papers and prepared to move on to the next case. His mind was focused on the law, as it always was. He didn't give Maya's words much thought. In his eyes, she had simply tried to deflect the consequences of her actions by bringing up an unrelated issue. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to use the courtroom as a platform for personal beliefs. He would move on, as always, confident in his role as a guardian of the law. But what Mallory didn't know was that Maya wasn't like the others who had come before him. She wasn't looking for sympathy or a way out. She was here for something far more significant, and he would soon learn just how deeply his decision would play into the unfolding narrative. Maya sat in her car for a moment, staring at the fine slip in her hands, the words on the paper blurring as she turned the key to start the engine. It wasn't the $200 that bothered her. It was the realization that, despite everything she had worked for, people still didn't see the bigger picture. Judge Mallory, the gallery, even the officers who'd issued her ticket, they only saw her as a minor offender, a person who had made a simple mistake. But Maya knew she was part of a much larger narrative. She had spent years confronting the deep-rooted issues in the justice system, and it wasn't just about a speeding ticket. Maya's journey into law hadn't been a straightforward one. Growing up in a low-income neighborhood, she had witnessed firsthand the disparities in how the justice system treated different communities. She had seen friends and family members caught in a web of harsh sentences, bail requirements, and systemic inequality that often had nothing to do with the true measure of justice. As a public defender, Maya had heard too many stories of young people, often from marginalized backgrounds, who were treated as criminals simply because of where they came from or the color of their skin. It was this knowledge, this deeply rooted understanding of the law's failures, that had propelled her into action. Maya had set out to challenge the status quo, to bring forth a new vision for the justice system, one that focused on rehabilitation, fairness, and equal treatment under the law. For years, she had worked quietly, behind the scenes, collaborating with legal experts, lawmakers, and advocacy groups to draft proposals aimed at reforming federal justice standards. She had worked on initiatives that sought to reduce mass incarceration, push for alternatives to cash bail, and change sentencing guidelines that disproportionately affected communities of color. Her latest project focused on establishing clearer guidelines for racial bias training among judges and law enforcement officers, something that she knew would make a tangible difference in addressing the systemic issues she had encountered throughout her career. And now, here she was, a minor speeding violation, in a courtroom where the very people who could help push her reforms were blind to the deeper issues. But Maya wasn't discouraged. If anything, this moment only made her more determined. She had always known that change wouldn't come easily, and she was prepared to fight for it, no matter how small the catalyst might be. As she drove home, Maya began to plan. She would use the media, the attention her case was receiving, and the fine that had sparked this chain of events to amplify her voice. The public needed to understand that the issues she was fighting for weren't abstract. They were personal, real, and affected millions of lives every day. Her fight was far from over, but this courtroom encounter had set the stage for a much larger battle, a battle she was more than ready to win. In the days following her court appearance, Maya's name began to circulate more widely than she ever expected. At first, it was just local news outlets reporting on her fine. A traffic violation. Nothing more than a minor incident, right? But the story quickly gained traction. Maya, a former public defender, wasn't just a woman caught in a routine court case. She was a symbol of something much larger. Her quiet refusal to bow down to the system was resonating with people who felt similarly overlooked by the very institutions meant to protect them. Maya's phone buzzed incessantly, filled with messages from colleagues, friends, and even strangers who supported her cause. Word spread about her deeper work in legal reform, her efforts to address the racial disparities in sentencing, the inequities in bail policies, and the calls for more rehabilitation-focused criminal justice were suddenly at the forefront. The story of Maya Thompson, the woman fined for speeding, began to symbolize a larger fight for justice and equality that the public hadn't realized was so urgent. Her inbox overflowed with invitations from advocacy groups and activists, all eager to hear her thoughts on the future of the justice system. They wanted to amplify her message, to turn her small personal case into a rallying cry for reform. Soon, Maya was being asked to appear on podcasts, contribute to discussions about legal policies, and meet with lawmakers who were starting to take notice of her. But Maya wasn't just riding a wave of media attention. She was determined to steer it in the right direction. Using the attention she had garnered from the fine, she began sharing the broader context of her work. She spoke about her experience representing countless individuals who had been caught in a system that often overlooked their humanity. She painted a picture of how the system disproportionately punished marginalized communities, leaving them with fewer opportunities to rebuild their lives after their first mistakes. The media quickly picked up on Maya's story, not just as a traffic violation, but as an example of the need for systemic change. It was a compelling narrative. A woman who had fought tirelessly for fairness, and now, after a minor infraction, found herself facing the very injustices she had spent years advocating against. Her case was no longer just about a fine. It became a reflection of how deeply ingrained the flaws in the system were. Behind the headlines, Judge Mallory, unaware of the storm his decision had set in motion, continued with his daily duties. The fine, a small part of his routine, had sparked something Maya had always known was possible. Now she wasn't just advocating for change from the sidelines. She was in the spotlight, and she wasn't going to let the moment slip away. The fight had just begun, and she was determined to see it through. Judge Richard Mallory sat behind his desk, reviewing case files as usual, but his mind kept drifting back to Maya Thompson. The case, so simple in his eyes, just another traffic violation, had snowballed into something he hadn't anticipated. The media attention, the interviews, the growing support for her cause. It was impossible to ignore. At first, Mallory had dismissed it as just another activist trying to hijack the legal process. But the more he saw, the more it gnawed at him. He found himself drawn into Maya's story, her background, and the work she had done to expose the cracks in the justice system. He didn't see it at first, but the more he read about her, the more he realized that her passion for reform wasn't just a passing crusade, it was a deeply personal mission. Maya wasn't someone looking for sympathy or a quick fix. She was working to change the very foundations of the system he had spent decades upholding. Mallory couldn't help but wonder how his decision to find her, so casually, almost without thought, had played into the larger issues she was fighting against. Was he, in fact, part of the problem? The realization came slowly, like a light creeping into a dark room. As Mallory scrolled through an article about Maya's work advocating for reduced incarceration and reformed sentencing practices, he felt an uncomfortable pang. Her arguments were thoughtful, well-reasoned, and urgent. The statistics she cited about racial disparities in the criminal justice system were hard to ignore. He had spent years hearing such claims, but this time it felt different. More real, more immediate. Mallory's position as a judge had always been about maintaining order, about keeping the system running smoothly. But Maya's work was about more than smooth operations. It was about ensuring that fairness was truly at the core of the system. His gavel, which he'd always wielded with such certainty, suddenly felt heavier in his hand. It wasn't that Mallory didn't believe in justice. He did, but the truth was, his understanding of it had always been shaped by the perspective of someone on the inside of the system. He was part of a world where rules were followed, where precedent held firm, and where those who broke the law faced clear consequences. But in all his years on the bench, he had never really looked at the law from the other side, from the perspective of those who were marginalized by it. The more Mallory thought about it, the more he realized how little he truly knew about the lives of people like Maya. How many others had quietly accepted their place in the system, without ever questioning its fairness. How many people had been forced into the very positions that Maya had been fighting to change? It was clear now that his decision to fine her was not just a routine judgment. It was a reminder of everything she had been working to expose, and it wasn't too late to do something about it. The question was, could he, a judge entrenched in tradition, be part of the change she was calling for? Maya knew she had reached a turning point. The days following her court appearance were filled with media requests, phone calls, and a swelling support base that had come to see her as the face of something bigger. She could feel the weight of the moment. This was her chance to push the conversation beyond the headlines and into meaningful change. With her legal background, Maya had always been able to navigate complex systems, but this was different. This wasn't just about fighting for a single case or trying to reform a policy. This was about a fundamental shift in how society viewed justice. She had always known that change in the justice system would be slow, but now she could feel the energy building. The public was finally paying attention to the inequalities that had long been present, and she wasn't about to let the opportunity slip away. Maya began working relentlessly to bring her message to the forefront. She was interviewed on national news outlets, where her calm and articulate explanations of the problems within the justice system captured the public's imagination. She spoke passionately about the need for federal sentencing reforms, particularly regarding racial disparities in incarceration and the biases that shaped legal proceedings across the country. The more she spoke, the more it became clear to her that people were hungry for change. Maya was not just advocating for abstract ideals. She was speaking for the communities who had been silenced for too long. Social media played a pivotal role in amplifying her message. Hashtags began to trend, with people sharing stories of their own experiences with a justice system that had failed them. Activists, reformists, and organizations dedicated to legal reform jumped on the bandwagon, providing support, rallying for legislative changes, and pushing back against the status quo. Maya's name became synonymous with the call for a more equitable and just legal system. But even as her profile grew, Maya knew that changing the law wasn't enough. It wasn't just about altering policies. It was about reshaping the culture within the legal system itself. She began drafting proposals for new laws that would not only reduce sentencing disparities, but also increase rehabilitation opportunities for incarcerated individuals. Maya was pushing for comprehensive training for judges and law enforcement officers to recognize and address implicit bias, something she had firsthand experience with in her years of practice. As she shared these proposals publicly, Maya's momentum continued to build. More and more people began to see her not just as a woman caught in a minor traffic infraction, but as a beacon of change, someone who was willing to fight against a system that had long been unresponsive to the needs of the most vulnerable. What had started as a small courtroom encounter had now turned into a national conversation about justice, equality, and reform. However, Maya was keenly aware that this was just the beginning. The real work was only starting, and she had no intention of backing down. Judge Mallory sat at his desk late one evening, his office quiet except for the occasional rustle of papers. The familiar hum of the courthouse had settled into a peaceful stillness, but his mind was anything but still. The events of the past few weeks had unsettled him in ways he hadn't expected. Every time he thought he had processed Maya Thompson's case, a new layer of realization seemed to unfold, pushing him to reconsider everything he had once taken for granted. He had followed the media coverage, watched Maya's interviews, and read articles about her work, her proposals for reform, her unflinching commitment to addressing racial bias within the legal system, and her dedication to rehabilitating offenders rather than merely punishing them. It was all so clear now. What he had initially dismissed as a simple case of a woman trying to shift attention away from her violation had grown into something far more complex. Mallory had prided himself on his adherence to the law. His entire career had been about upholding what was written in black and white. The rules were clear. Justice was supposed to be blind. And yet, with every new piece of information about Maya, every story about the inequalities in sentencing, He couldn't shake the feeling that the system he had been serving for decades was failing in ways he hadn't fully understood until now. It wasn't just about a speeding ticket anymore. It was about something deeper, the subtle biases embedded in the very structure of the law. He had spent years following precedents, but Maya's work, her life's mission, forced him to question whether those precedents were actually just a cover for injustice. His gavel, once a symbol of impartiality, now felt like a tool of a system that had been blindly perpetuating inequalities. Judge Mallory's thoughts raced. He couldn't pretend to be unaware anymore. The moment had passed where he could dismiss the issue as someone else's problem. Maya's words, her calm but resolute advocacy for change, had pierced through his defenses. He had been so focused on the law's rigidity that he hadn't considered how it could be wielded against the very people it was meant to protect. Unable to shake the growing sense of responsibility, Mallory took a step he hadn't anticipated. He reached out to Maya. It was a tentative move, a signal that he wanted to understand more about the changes she was advocating for. The message he sent was simple but laden with an unspoken acknowledgement of the weight behind it. Would you be willing to meet and discuss the ideas you've shared publicly? He wasn't sure what would come of it, but for the first time in a long while, Judge Mallory felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was an opportunity to bridge the gap between the law as it had always been and the law as it could be. A law that wasn't just about punishment, but about fairness, rehabilitation, and justice for all. The ball was in Maya's court now. Would she accept? Would she take the opportunity to engage with someone who had, until recently, been part of the very system she sought to change? The judge waited, unsure of what would come next, but for the first time in years, he felt something akin to uncertainty, and that, he realized, might be the first step toward real change. Maya stared at the message from Judge Mallory, her fingers hovering over her phone screen. It was brief, but the words carried a weight she hadn't anticipated. Would you be willing to meet and discuss the ideas you shared publicly? She read it several times, processing the unexpected outreach. This wasn't the same judge who had handed down her fine just a few weeks ago. The tone was different, almost tentative, as if he were asking for permission to understand. Maya had no illusions about the challenges she faced in reforming a deeply entrenched system. She knew that people in positions of power, like Judge Mallory, were often resistant to change, unwilling to acknowledge how the rules they had followed for years could contribute to the very injustices they swore to prevent. But there was something in the judge's words that suggested he was open to listening, to reevaluating his role in a system that many, including Maya, felt was broken. She didn't hesitate. Maya knew that this was a moment to seize. If the judge was willing to engage, then it was her responsibility to ensure that the conversation was meaningful. She quickly typed a reply, agreeing to meet, but she also made it clear that this wouldn't be a simple discussion. The justice system needed reform, and Mallory's participation, both in understanding the issues and in taking action, would be crucial. Their meeting took place a week later in a small cafe, a neutral space far from the courtroom where they had first met. Maya arrived early, a stack of papers with her latest proposals in hand. When Judge Mallory walked in, he was less formal than she had expected. His demeanor, while still dignified, felt more human, more open than it had been in the courtroom. He greeted her with a handshake, and they quickly sat down, the conversation beginning with a slow but steady momentum. Maya started by outlining the core issues she had been fighting for: changes in sentencing guidelines, the need for expanded racial bias training, and the importance of rehabilitation over punishment. She spoke with passion, but also with the deep knowledge she had gained through years of experience as a public defender. She didn't hold back, explaining how the system, in its current form, hurt people who had already been marginalized by society. To her surprise, Mallory listened intently. He didn't interrupt, nor did he try to defend the status quo. Instead, he asked questions, thoughtful ones that demonstrated he was beginning to grapple with the very issues Maya had been advocating for. His curiosity wasn't just about understanding her ideas. It was about understanding the real-world implications of those ideas. As the meeting progressed, something shifted. It wasn't a sudden transformation, but an acknowledgement that change was not only possible, it was necessary. Mallory knew his position as a judge could help push these reforms forward, but it would take work. Real work. Together, they began to sketch out ways they could collaborate, leveraging their respective platforms to champion the changes that had seemed impossible only months before. When they parted ways that afternoon, neither Maya nor Judge Mallory knew exactly what the future would hold. But they both knew something had shifted, something fundamental. The system wasn't just going to change because of one person's efforts, but with people like Maya, and with Mallory now open to reconsidering his own role, the possibility for meaningful reform suddenly felt within reach, and for the first time in a long time, both of them felt that the path forward might not be so impossible after all.